Picture yourself settling into the quiet darkness of your room tonight as somewhere far from here. Winter winds whisper across empty plains where ancient footsteps once pressed into snow. What secrets did those people carry? Those who faced storms that could erase the world in white, armed with nothing but earth, wood, and hide. How did they transform the very elements that threatened to destroy them into walls of warmth? How did they find rest when blizzards raged for days without mercy? And what can their quiet struggle teach us about the delicate line between survival and surrender? Before we step into this hushed journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of North America, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. I treasure seeing how far our circle of time travelers reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. You wake not to sunlight filtering through windows, but to the muffled roar of wind pressing against hide walls that shiver and strain like living things. Your breath forms small clouds in the air above your sleeping furs, and somewhere in the darkness a baby cries, a thin sound nearly lost beneath the storm's endless voice. This is not your storm. This is not your choice. You are simply here, in this moment, in this fragile shelter, and the blizzard decides whether you will see another dawn. Feel the cold creeping through the seams where yesterday you thought you had sealed every gap. Your fingers, still stiff from sleep, search for the familiar weight of your heaviest robe. The fire that seemed so generous last night has burned low, and the small pile of carefully gathered wood beside the central pit looks smaller now, more precious, rationed against the unknown length of this storm. The rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, waking not to comfort, but to the immediate arithmetic of survival. Your dwelling is modest, a dome of bent saplings covered in layered birch bark and hides, banked with snow that serves as both insulation and prison. The entrance faces away from the prevailing wind, a lesson learned through generations of winter teaching. But even the wisest positioning cannot fully defeat a blizzard that seems to come from all directions at once, finding every weakness, every overlooked gap in your defenses. You rise carefully in the low space, your back already aching from months of moving in this cramped shelter. The ceiling barely clears your head when you sit upright. This is no grand lodge. This is survival distilled to its essence, every element chosen for function over comfort. The walls curve around you like cupped hands, creating a pocket of humanity in the endless white wilderness beyond. The fire requires constant attention, not the casual tending of a modern hearth, but the vigilant care of something upon which life itself depends. You know exactly how many pieces of wood remain, how long each will burn, which types of bark will catch quickly, and which will smoulder slowly through the long hours of the storm. Every flame is precious, every ember guarded like a fragile secret. Your hands move through familiar motions, adjusting the ventilation hole at the top of the lodge, checking that snow hasn't blocked the smoke's escape, feeding small pieces of wood to coax the fire back to steady warmth. The smoke stings your eyes, has stung them for months now, leaving them perpetually red and watery. Your hair carries the scent of burning wood, your clothes, your skin, everything bears the persistent perfume of the hearth that keeps you alive. Around you, other members of your family begin their own slow emergence from sleep. An elderly grandmother sits up with careful movements, her joints stiff from the cold and damp. A young mother checks her infant, ensuring the baby stayed warm beneath the careful layers of rabbit fur and her own body heat throughout the night. A teenager, barely past childhood, tends to his younger siblings with movements that show he has learned responsibility early in this unforgiving world. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, each morning, beginning with the same quiet inventory of survival. Outside, the storm continues its relentless conversation with itself. Wind howls with a voice that seems almost alive, sometimes rising to a shriek, sometimes dropping to a low moan that vibrates through the ground beneath your shelter. Snow pelts the hide covering with a sound like scattered seeds, and occasionally you hear the sharp crack of a tree limb breaking under the weight of ice. But inside your shelter, there is a different quality of sound, muffled, intimate, human. The soft rustle of someone adjusting their sleeping robes. The gentle scrape of a wooden spoon against a birchbark container. The whispered conversation between adults trying not to wake the children. These sounds create a pocket of civilization in the wilderness of the storm, a reminder that human life persists even in the harshest conditions. Your morning meal is simple, rationed with the careful mathematics of uncertainty. A small portion of pemmican, that concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that represents summer's abundance preserved for winter's scarcity. Perhaps a handful of parched corn softened with a little warm water, maybe some dried squash, tough and chewy, but offering the body's memory of harvest time. Every bite is considered, every portion calculated against the unknown duration of the storm and the uncertain availability of future provisions. The water situation requires constant attention. Snow must be melted over the fire, but too much melting at once wastes fuel, while too little leaves everyone thirsty. Ice forms in containers left too far from the heat. You learn to keep a small amount of water near your body at night, using your own warmth to prevent freezing, though this means sleeping with hard containers pressed against your ribs, adding to the discomfort of your rest. A quiet struggle, repeated endlessly. The simple acts that keep life flickering in the face of winter's assault. As the morning progresses, tasks emerge that have nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with continuation. Someone must check the entrance tunnel, ensuring that drifting snow hasn't blocked the only way in or out of the shelter. This is delicate work. Clear too much snow and you lose insulation, clear too little and you risk being trapped inside if the storm worsens. The hide walls require constant inspection and adjustment. Wind finds the smallest gaps and exploits them ruthlessly. You run your hands along the seams, feeling for places where the cold air penetrates, then carefully adjust the overlapping skins, sometimes chinking gaps with moss or grass you gathered during the brief autumn preparation time. Your fingers are always cold during this work, growing numb as they perform the precise movements needed to maintain your shelter's integrity. Inside the lodge, space is at a premium. Every item has its designated place, not from tidiness but from necessity. Sleeping robes must be kept away from areas where melting snow might drip. Food containers need protection from both cold and the occasional spark from the fire. Tools and weapons rest in carefully chosen spots where they won't be damaged by moisture or movement in the cramped quarters. The social dynamics of storm survival create their own tensions and comforts. Privacy becomes an impossible luxury when several people share a space barely large enough for one person to lie stretched out completely. Tempers can flare over trivial matters, someone taking more than their fair share of space near the fire, a child being too restless during the long hours of enforced stillness, adults making decisions about rationing that affect everyone but can't be debated at length in such close quarters. Yet these same cramped conditions create intimacy impossible in more spacious times. Stories are told in whispers that reach every ear. Songs are hummed so quietly they seem to emerge from the walls themselves. The elderly share memories of previous storms, offering both comfort and practical knowledge to those experiencing such severity for the first time. Children learn patience not through punishment, but through the simple necessity of stillness when stillness means survival. Your body adapts to this confined existence in ways both practical and uncomfortable. Your muscles cramp from the constant hunched posture required by the low ceiling. Your skin grows pale from the absence of sunlight, and your eyes become sensitive to the perpetual dimness punctuated only by firelight. Sleep becomes fitful, too cold when the fire burns low, too warm when someone tends it back to full flame, constantly interrupted by the needs of others sharing the small space. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there. Learning that survival is not a single, heroic act, but a long, patient endurance of small discomforts. Clothing becomes a complex system rather than simple covering. Multiple layers trap air for insulation, but they also trap moisture from your body, requiring careful management to prevent the dampness that can turn protection into danger. Outer layers of hide shed wind and snow, while inner layers of softer materials provide warmth close to the skin. But everything must be dried periodically near the fire, and in the confined space of the storm shelter, this means a constant rotation of damp garments creating humid air that makes the small space feel even smaller. Your moccasins never fully dry. The hide softens and stretches when wet, meaning they fit differently each day, sometimes loose enough to allow cold air in, sometimes tight enough to restrict circulation. You stuff them with dried grass or moss for insulation, but this material also becomes damp and must be replaced regularly from your dwindling supply of dry stuffing materials. Food preparation in the storm shelter requires innovation and patience. Cooking space is limited to the area immediately around the fire, and smoke must be managed carefully to avoid overwhelming the small interior. Meals are simple by necessity, nothing that requires complex preparation or creates strong odors that would become oppressive in the enclosed space. You learn to appreciate subtle flavors, to find satisfaction in simple combinations, to make each small portion feel like nourishment for both body and spirit. Water discipline becomes second nature. Every drop is precious, not because it's scarce, snow provides unlimited raw material, but because melting it costs fuel, and fuel is always limited. You learn to use the minimum water necessary for drinking, cooking, and essential washing. Personal hygiene becomes simplified to its most basic elements, and everyone accepts the gradual accumulation of smoke, sweat, and the particular odors of people living in very close quarters. A quiet struggle, repeated endlessly. The gradual wearing down of comfort, the slow accommodation to hardship as the new normal. The psychological challenge of the storm shelter may be greater than the physical one. Days pass without any clear sense of time beyond the cycle of sleeping and waking, the rhythm of feeding the fire, the regular need for food and water. Outside, the world has become uniformly white and hostile. Inside, the same familiar faces, the same small space, the same limited activities create a sense of suspension, as if normal life has paused and may never resume. Boredom becomes a luxury you cannot afford, because boredom requires the assumption that this situation is temporary, that entertainment and variety will soon return. Instead, you learn a kind of active patience, a way of being present in each moment without constantly longing for it to pass. You find interest in small things, the different sounds the fire makes as it burns different types of wood, the changing patterns of shadows on the curved walls, the subtle variations in the storm's voice outside. Children handle this suspension differently than adults. They adapt quickly to the confined space, creating games that can be played in near silence and near darkness. They stack small objects in patterns, tell stories using gestures, practice skills like knot tying or simple weaving that will serve them in adulthood. But they also grow restless more quickly, requiring constant gentle guidance, to keep their energy from disrupting the careful peace that maintains everyone's sanity. The elderly often become the keepers of continuity during these storm-bound periods. Their memories reach back to previous winters, previous storms, previous times when survival seemed impossible but was ultimately achieved. They offer reassurance not through false promises that the storm will end soon, but through the deeper comfort of demonstrating that humans have survived such conditions before and can do so again. Imagine yourself there, feeling the weight of responsibility not just for your own survival, but for the survival of the group that depends on your contributions to the collective effort of staying alive. Night and day blur together in the storm shelter. The fire provides the only light, and its needs determine the rhythm of activity rather than the position of the sun. Someone must always be alert enough to tend the fire, which means sleep becomes communal responsibility. People take turns staying partially awake, ready to add fuel or adjust airflow as needed. Dreams in the storm shelter often feature open spaces, warm sunlight, and abundant food. You wake from these dreams to the reality of curved walls, smoky air, and carefully rationed meals, and the contrast emphasizes how completely your life has been reduced to these essential elements. Yet there is also a strange comfort in this reduction, a clarity that comes from knowing exactly what matters and what doesn't. The storm shapes time itself. Without sunrise and sunset to mark the passing of days, without the ability to move freely between different activities and locations, time stretches and compresses unpredictably. A single day can feel like a week of monotonous waiting, or a week can seem to pass in what feels like a single, extended moment of focused survival. Your hands become tools shaped by the storm's demands. They grow skilled at working in near darkness, at performing delicate tasks while wearing thick mittens, at judging temperature and texture and moisture content through touch alone. They learn to conserve movement to accomplish necessary tasks with minimum motion because every unnecessary movement wastes energy and heat. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, discovering that survival is an art requiring both technical skill and spiritual endurance. As days blend into each other, marked only by the cycles of sleeping and waking, eating and tending the fire, you begin to understand something profound about human resilience. This is not the dramatic heroism of stories, but something quieter and perhaps more remarkable, the ability to continue functioning, to maintain care for others, to preserve hope and humanity under conditions that strip away almost everything except the basic fact of being alive. The storm teaches patience of a quality unknown in easier times. Not the impatient patience of waiting for something pleasant to begin, but the deep patience of accepting that this moment, difficult as it is, may be the only moment available, and therefore must be lived as fully as possible. You learn to find small satisfactions, the perfect adjustment of the fire that creates steady warmth without wasting fuel, the successful repair of a gap in the wall covering, the quiet contentment of lying warm under sleeping robes while wind howls outside. Food begins to taste different when it represents not pleasure but continuation. Simple combinations become complex experiences when your senses are heightened by scarcity and confined attention. A piece of dried meat chewed slowly releases layers of flavor, memory, and gratitude. Water warmed over the fire becomes a luxury worthy of careful appreciation, a quiet struggle repeated endlessly, but also a quiet triumph repeated with each successful day, each night when everyone stays warm, each morning when the fire still burns and life continues. The social bonds forged in storm shelters have a quality different from friendships or family relationships developed in easier circumstances. These are connections created by mutual dependence, by shared vulnerability, by the knowledge that each person's well-being directly affects everyone else's survival. Trust becomes practical necessity rather than emotional choice. Cooperation happens not because people are naturally good, but because cooperation is the only path to continuation. Yet within these bonds of necessity, genuine care and affection flourish. The grandmother who shares her warmest sleeping robe with a child. The young hunter who gives up his portion of meat to ensure the pregnant woman has enough nourishment. The teenager who stays awake during his fire-tending shift with extra attention, singing quietly to himself to stay alert, and coincidentally providing gentle sound that helps others sleep. These acts of consideration emerge from the recognition that individual survival is impossible, that the group must succeed for anyone to succeed. Your body learns new definitions of comfort and discomfort. What seemed unbearable on the first day of the storm becomes tolerable on the third, acceptable on the fifth, barely noticeable by the second week. The human capacity for adaptation reveals itself as one of our most remarkable survival traits. Aches and pains that would have demanded attention in normal life become background sensations, acknowledged but not permitted to dominate consciousness. The storm shelter teaches you that home is not a place but a condition. The condition of being protected, of belonging somewhere, of sharing space with others who care whether you live or die. This knowledge changes how you think about shelter itself. The curved walls that seemed so confining at first begin to feel protective. The low ceiling that forced you to hunch and crouch becomes familiar, proportioned correctly for the kind of life being lived within it. Imagine yourself there, feeling the slow transformation of hardship into a different kind of normal, discovering strength you didn't know you possessed. As the storm continues, for storms of this severity can last days or even weeks, you begin to understand why your ancestors chose this life, why they developed these techniques, why they persisted in regions where survival required such intimate knowledge of winter's demands. It is not because life was easy, but because life was possible, and possibility is enough when the alternative is extinction. The fire becomes more than a source of heat and light. It becomes the center of a small universe, the focal point around which all other activities organize themselves. Its needs structure time, its presence defines safety, its fragility reminds everyone of their own fragility. Its persistence demonstrates that continuation is possible even under the most difficult circumstances. Your relationship with the storm itself evolves during the long days of being confined by its power. At first, it seems like a malevolent force, an enemy to be defeated or endured. Gradually, you begin to understand it as a natural phenomenon, neither good nor evil, simply one of the conditions within which life must be lived. This acceptance does not make the storm less dangerous, but it makes your response to it more effective, less exhausting, more sustainable over the long period required for the weather to change. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, learning that survival is not about conquering nature, but about finding your place within its larger patterns. Sleep in the storm shelter requires a different relationship with rest than sleep in comfortable circumstances. You learn to sleep lightly, ready to wake if the fire needs attention or if changing conditions require response. You learn to sleep in positions that conserve warmth but allow quick movement if necessary. You learn to sleep despite discomfort, despite noise, despite the constant awareness that your safety depends on maintaining the conditions that keep the shelter functioning. Dreams during storm confinement often feature movement, running across open plains, walking through forests, traveling freely between different places. These dreams serve as psychological release, allowing the mind to experience the mobility that physical circumstances have made impossible. Waking from such dreams intensifies awareness of confinement, but it also strengthens appreciation for the protection the shelter provides. The storm will eventually end, you know this, but knowing it intellectually is different from feeling it emotionally. Each day tests faith in the possibility of change, in the return of normal weather, in the survival of the group until conditions improve. This faith must be maintained without external evidence. supported only by experience of previous storms, by trust in the shelter techniques developed over generations, by commitment to continuing the behaviors that make survival possible. A quiet struggle, repeated endlessly, but also a quiet victory over despair, a daily choice to continue caring for yourself and others despite circumstances that make caring difficult. As we drift away from this intimate portrait of storm survival, as we leave behind the smoky warmth of the shelter and the muffled roar of wind against hide walls, we carry with us the understanding that human resilience takes many forms. Sometimes it looks like dramatic action, but more often it looks like this: the patient repetition of small acts that maintain life, the quiet cooperation that enables survival, the daily choice to continue existing even when existence has been reduced to its most basic elements. The people who lived through these storms were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were simply humans who had learned through necessity and tradition how to persist under conditions that would challenge any of us today. Their strength lay not in their ability to conquer winter, but in their willingness to accommodate themselves to winter's demands while maintaining the essential elements of human life: warmth, nourishment, companionship, and hope for eventual change. As the sun fades, let us shift our attention to another life that unfolded in these same storms. In the vast expanse of the northern Great Plains, where winter arrives early and departs late, where blizzards can transform familiar landscapes into alien worlds of white silence, there lived a man whose name carried the weight of his people's survival. Little Shell, Ayabe in his own Ojibwe language, a name that spoke not of his stature, but of the sacred items that connected him to generations of leaders who had guided their people through countless seasons of hardship. His story is not one of dramatic battles or grand speeches, but something quieter and perhaps more profound. The story of a leader whose greatest victories were measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the simple fact that his people continued to wake each morning, that families stayed together through the harshest conditions, that children learned the skills they would need to survive winters yet to come. The rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, following a leader whose burden was not glory, but the endless responsibility of keeping people alive. Little Shell came to leadership during a time when leadership itself was being redefined by forces beyond any single person's control. The world his grandfathers had known, where seasonal migrations followed the buffalo herds, where winter camps were chosen based on centuries of accumulated wisdom about wind patterns and water sources, was disappearing beneath the pressure of treaties, boundaries, and policies created by people who had never spent a winter in a bark lodge with snow piled to the roof. He was born into the knowledge that leadership among his people meant something different from the command structures that newcomers understood. A chief's authority came not from the power to compel obedience, but from the demonstrated ability to make decisions that served the group's survival. Every choice he made would be judged not by abstract principles of right and wrong, but by the practical standard of whether it helped his people live through another winter. The Pembina band of Ojibwe that looked to Little Shell for guidance had developed, over countless generations, a sophisticated understanding of how to survive in the region where the Great Plains met the northern forests. They knew which types of wood burned longest and produced the least smoke, which animals provided the best winter clothing, how to construct shelters that could withstand the particular combination of wind and temperature that characterized their homeland storms. But knowledge that had sustained them for centuries was being challenged by circumstances no previous generation had faced. Treaty boundaries created by distant officials often separated people from their traditional wintering grounds. Promises of government supplies sometimes failed to materialize at crucial moments. The buffalo herds that had provided meat, hides, and bones for shelter construction were becoming unreliable, hunted by commercial operations that took only the most valuable parts and left the rest to rot on the prairie. Elsewhere, another life unfolds, shaped by the same storms but carrying the additional weight of responsibility for others' survival. Little Shell's leadership was tested repeatedly by winters that seemed to grow more difficult each year, not because the weather was changing, but because the circumstances in which his people faced the weather were becoming more precarious. A bad storm that previous generations might have weathered comfortably in well-supplied winter camps now became a potential catastrophe when supplies were delayed, when access to traditional hunting grounds was restricted, when families were scattered across unfamiliar territories. Imagine him in the depths of a particularly harsh winter, moving between the scattered shelters of his band, checking on families, assessing supplies, making decisions about when to move and when to stay put. His own comfort was always secondary to his responsibilities. While others could focus entirely on their immediate survival needs, he had to maintain awareness of the larger picture, which families had adequate food stores, which shelters needed reinforcement, which hunters were having success, and which were struggling. The weight of leadership in winter camps was particularly heavy because mistakes had immediate, visible consequences. A poor decision about where to establish winter quarters could expose families to dangerous winds. Miscalculating food supplies could mean watching children grow thin while waiting for hunting conditions to improve. Failing to maintain unity within the group could lead to families departing on their own, reducing everyone's chances of survival. Little Shell learned to read the subtle signs that indicated how his people were coping with the stress of difficult winters. The way a mother held her child could reveal whether she was confident in their food supplies or beginning to worry. The tone of conversations around evening fires could suggest whether the group's morale remained strong or was beginning to crack under the pressure of prolonged hardship. The willingness of hunters to share information about game movements reflected their trust in the leadership and their commitment to the collective effort. His own shelter during winter camps was typically no larger or more comfortable than those of the families he led. Leadership among the Ojibwe did not traditionally include material privileges that separated chiefs from their people, especially during times of hardship. If anything, leaders were expected to take smaller portions when food was scarce, to give up personal comfort when the needs of others were greater, to stay awake longer and worry more deeply about problems that affected the entire group. A quiet struggle, repeated endlessly. The burden of making decisions when all available choices carry risks. The art of winter leadership required skills that were rarely dramatic, but always essential. Little Shell had to be able to judge the mood of his people accurately enough to know when they could endure additional hardship and when they needed some relief from the constant pressure of survival. He had to understand the capabilities and limitations of individual families well enough to make assignments and requests that people could actually fulfill. He had to maintain his own emotional equilibrium despite the constant stress of knowing that his decisions could determine who lived and who died. During the long nights of winter storms when families huddled in their individual shelters, Little Shell often moved through the camp despite the dangerous conditions, checking on the elderly, ensuring that no family was struggling in isolation, carrying news and encouragement from shelter to shelter. These visits served practical purposes. They allowed him to identify problems before they became crises, to redistribute resources when necessary, to coordinate activities that required group cooperation. But the visits also served a deeper purpose. They reminded people that they were not alone in their individual struggles, that someone was paying attention to their welfare, that their survival mattered to the larger community. In storms that could last for days, isolating families in their individual shelters, these connections became lifelines that sustained morale as much as physical supplies sustained life. The knowledge that Little Shell carried was not written in books or preserved in formal documents. It lived in his memory and in the memories of the elders who had taught him. Knowledge about which valleys provided the best protection from north winds, which types of trees indicated reliable water sources, how to judge the severity of an approaching storm by the behavior of animals and the quality of light on the horizon. This traditional knowledge was being complicated by the changing circumstances of his people's lives. Treaties and government policies sometimes forced them to winter in areas their ancestors had avoided, places where the old techniques for shelter construction or food preservation might not work as well. Little Shell had to constantly adapt traditional wisdom to new situations, testing whether ancient methods would succeed in unfamiliar environments. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, learning that leadership is not about having easy answers, but about maintaining hope when answers are difficult to find. The relationship between Little Shell and the US government officials who were increasingly involved in his people's affairs was complicated by fundamental differences in how they understood the challenges of winter survival. Officials who lived in heated buildings and had access to reliable supply chains found it difficult to comprehend the life-or-death significance of seemingly minor policy decisions. A delay in delivering promised blankets, a restriction on hunting in traditional areas, a requirement to relocate during the season when travel was most dangerous. Little Shell spent considerable time trying to explain these realities to officials who had the power to make decisions affecting his people's survival, but who often lacked the experience to understand the consequences of those decisions. He became skilled at translating the immediate practical concerns of winter survival into the language of bureaucracy and policy, though this translation was often imperfect and frequently frustrating. The negotiations and meetings that were part of his leadership role often took him away from his people during critical times. While he sat in government offices trying to secure promises of supplies or permissions for traditional activities, his band faced the daily challenges of winter survival without his immediate guidance. This created a constant tension between his responsibilities as a negotiator with outside authorities and his duties as a leader of his own community. Yet even when physically absent, Little Shell's influence continued to shape how his people responded to winter challenges. The systems of cooperation and resource sharing that he had helped establish continued to function in his absence. The individuals he had mentored in various survival skills took on increased responsibilities. The traditions he had helped preserve provided guidance for decisions that had to be made without consulting him. During extended winter camps, when storms made travel impossible and the outside world seemed to disappear entirely, Little Shell's leadership took on a different quality. Without the distractions and pressures of dealing with external authorities, he could focus entirely on the immediate needs of his people. These periods often revealed the depth of his understanding of human nature and his skill at managing the social dynamics that could make the difference between a winter camp that preserved community unity and one that dissolved into conflict and fragmentation. The stories told around winter fires during Little Shell's time as a leader often reflected the particular challenges his generation faced. Traditional stories about surviving harsh winters were supplemented by newer tales about adapting to changed circumstances, about finding ways to maintain cultural continuity despite external pressures, about the importance of flexibility without abandoning essential principles. Elsewhere, another life unfolds, shaped by the collision between ancient wisdom and modern circumstances. Little Shell's own family life was inevitably shaped by his leadership responsibilities. His children grew up understanding that their father's attention was shared with the entire community, that their family's resources were available to others in times of need, that their personal comfort was often secondary to the welfare of families facing greater hardships. This created both opportunities and burdens. They learned responsibility and community loyalty at an early age, but they also sometimes felt the weight of expectations and the pressure of being constantly observed as examples to other young people. His wife played a crucial role that was often invisible to outsiders but essential to the functioning of his leadership. She managed the practical aspects of their household in ways that freed him to focus on community responsibilities, served as an informal counselor to women in the community who needed guidance or support, and provided him with insights into family situations and community dynamics that might not be apparent from his more formal leadership interactions. The seasonal rhythm of Little Shell's leadership responsibilities followed patterns that were both traditional and adapted to contemporary circumstances. Summer months involved extensive travel for negotiations with government officials, meetings with other tribal leaders, and efforts to secure resources for the coming winter. Fall was the crucial time for establishing winter camps, organizing hunting activities, and ensuring that families were prepared for the harsh months ahead. But it was during the winter months themselves that Little Shell's leadership was most severely tested. When storms isolated communities for days or weeks, when food supplies ran low, when illnesses spread through confined populations, when the stress of survival strained relationships and patience, these were the moments when the quality of leadership became most apparent and most crucial. A quiet struggle repeated endlessly. The challenge of maintaining hope and unity when external circumstances make both hope and unity difficult to sustain. The legacy that Little Shell hoped to leave was not measured in territories claimed or battles won, but in the continuation of his people's ability to survive as a community. He understood that the specific challenges his generation faced might be different from those that future generations would encounter, but he believed that the skills and values that enabled survival, cooperation, adaptability, respect for traditional knowledge combined with willingness to learn new methods would remain relevant regardless of changing circumstances. His influence on the young people in his community was particularly important during winter camps, when extended periods of enforced proximity provided opportunities for intensive teaching and learning. The survival skills he passed on were not just technical knowledge about shelter construction or food preservation, but deeper understanding about how communities could support each other through difficult times, how individual sacrifice could serve collective welfare, how tradition and innovation could be balanced to meet new challenges. The final years of Little Shell's active leadership were marked by increasing pressure from government policies that sought to transform his people's way of life fundamentally. The boarding school system that removed children from their families, the allotment policies that broke up communal landholdings, the restrictions on traditional religious practices, all of these changes threatened the cultural foundations upon which traditional winter survival had been based. Little Shell's response to these pressures was characteristically pragmatic. He recognized that some changes were inevitable and that his people's survival might require adapting to new circumstances. But he also worked to preserve the essential elements of traditional knowledge and community organization that he believed would remain necessary regardless of changing external conditions. As his leadership role gradually passed to younger members of his community, Little Shell could look back on winters survived, families kept together, traditions preserved despite enormous pressure for abandonment. His legacy lived not in monuments or formal recognitions, but in the practical knowledge that continued to help people survive, in the community bonds that persisted despite efforts to fragment them, in the quiet resilience that enabled his people to adapt to changed circumstances without losing their essential identity. The rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, understanding that some victories are measured not in dramatic moments, but in the simple continuation of life itself. The storms that tested Little Shell and his people were not just meteorological events, but symbols of all the forces that threatened to overwhelm small communities trying to maintain their way of life in the face of massive historical changes. His leadership during these storms, both literal and metaphorical, demonstrated that survival often depends not on dramatic heroism, but on the quiet persistence of people who refuse to give up, who continue to care for each other even when caring is difficult, who maintain hope even when the immediate future appears uncertain. As we move away from Little Shell's story, as we leave behind the winter camps where he made decisions that affected the survival of entire families, we carry with us an understanding of leadership that is both humble and profound. True leadership, his life suggests, is not about commanding others, but about accepting responsibility for their welfare. It is not about avoiding difficult decisions, but about making them with full awareness of their consequences. It is not about seeking personal glory, but about serving something larger than oneself. The winters that Little Shell helped his people survive were harsh by any measure, but they were made survivable by the quality of care that people extended to each other, by the wisdom that guided their preparations and responses, by the community bonds that provided strength beyond what any individual could possess alone. In this, his story connects directly to our own lives, reminding us that we too depend on others for our survival, that we too have responsibilities to our communities, that we too must find ways to persist through difficulties that sometimes seem overwhelming. Let us now drift from daily struggle into mystery, into the quiet enigma of snow itself. There is something almost magical in the transformation. The same substance that falls from the sky to bury villages, to freeze rivers solid, to make travel impossible and survival desperate, can be shaped by human hands into walls that preserve life. Snow, the killer and the savior, the enemy and the ally, existing in the same crystalline form, but serving opposite purposes depending entirely on human knowledge and skill. Picture yourself kneeling in the bitter cold, your breath forming clouds as you work with bare hands to pack snow into blocks, each one carefully shaped and positioned to create a wall between your family and the storm that rages beyond. The very element that threatens to end your life becomes, through ancient wisdom and patient labor, the foundation of your survival. This is the central mystery of winter dwelling, the alchemical transformation of danger into protection. Feel the contradiction in your hands as you work. The snow that numbs your fingers is the same substance that will keep your children warm through the long night ahead. Each handful pressed into place carries this duality, crystalline death and crystalline salvation, united in molecular structure, yet divided by human intention and understanding. The irony cuts deeper than the wind. You must expose yourself to winter's killing touch to build the barrier that will preserve life. The physics of this transformation reveal themselves slowly to those who work with snow across many seasons. Fresh snow, composed of up to 90% air, trapped between ice crystals, provides excellent insulation precisely because of this seemingly fragile structure. Yet when compressed and shaped by knowing hands, those same crystals bond and merge, creating building blocks that can support substantial weight while maintaining their insulating properties. The process requires understanding the precise balance. Too little compression leaves unstable structures. Too much destroys the air spaces that provide thermal protection. The rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, learning to see snow not as obstruction, but as raw material for salvation. Different snow conditions demanded entirely different approaches, and traditional builders developed sophisticated classification systems for identifying the optimal building material. Wind-packed snow, hardened by days of driving air currents, offered structural strength but required different cutting techniques than the softer accumulations found in sheltered valleys. Powder snow could be transformed through careful layering and compression, while wet snow from warming periods demanded immediate use before freezing made it unworkable. The seasonal timing of snow harvesting was crucial knowledge passed between generations. Early winter snow often lacked the bonding properties that developed through repeated freeze-thaw cycles, while late-season snow might be too dense or contaminated with debris. Master builders could read the history of weather patterns in the texture and color of available snow, understanding how temperature fluctuations and wind patterns had affected its structural properties. Temperature management during construction represented another layer of complexity rarely appreciated by modern observers. Working with snow in extremely cold conditions required balancing the need to maintain body heat with the necessity of handling materials that became unworkable if warmed too much. Traditional builders learned to work in short, intensive bursts, warming themselves at carefully tended fires between construction phases, timing their labor to match daily temperature patterns that made certain tasks easier at specific hours. Archaeological evidence whispers to us across centuries, offering tantalizing glimpses of techniques that once meant the difference between life and death. Excavations in the northern plains and subarctic regions reveal circular depressions in the earth, often overlooked by casual observers, that once held the foundations of structures designed to harness snow's insulating properties. These subtle marks in the landscape are like ancient blueprints, encoding knowledge that kept people alive through countless winters. The depressions are typically 12 to 16 feet in diameter, just large enough for an extended family, but small enough to heat efficiently with a single fire. Around these circles, archaeologists sometimes find patterns of post holes where wooden frameworks once stood, bent saplings or straight poles that provided the skeleton upon which layers of bark, hide, and snow were built. The arrangement of these holes tells stories about construction techniques passed down through generations, about the precise angles and spacing that created maximum stability with minimum materials. Recent advances in archaeological techniques have revealed additional layers of complexity in these ancient sites. Ground-penetrating radar sometimes detects subsurface features that suggest sophisticated drainage systems carefully constructed to channel meltwater away from living areas without compromising structural integrity. These drainage features, often consisting of shallow trenches lined with stones or organic materials, demonstrate understanding of how snow structures interact with changing ground conditions throughout the winter season. Soil analysis from excavated sites reveals microscopic evidence of construction techniques that left no visible traces. Pollen samples trapped in ancient living layers tell stories about the organic materials that were mixed with snow for insulation. Dried grasses, leaves, even animal fur, each contributing specific properties to the overall thermal performance of the structure. Chemical analysis of soil residues can identify the use of natural binders like pine pitch or animal fats that helped snow blocks adhere more effectively. But the most intriguing archaeological evidence is often the most ephemeral, slight changes in soil color that indicate where organic materials once lay, microscopic traces of charcoal that mark ancient hearth locations, subtle variations in ground texture that suggest how people moved through these spaces during the months of occupation. These traces require expert interpretation to reveal their secrets, and even then, much of the story remains hidden. Bone fragment analysis from winter dwelling sites provides insight into tool technologies that were essential for snow construction. Scrapers carved from caribou shoulder blades show wear patterns consistent with snow cutting and shaping activities. Antler pieces modified into measuring devices suggest standardization in snowblock dimensions that enhanced construction efficiency and structural performance. Even broken bone fragments can provide clues about improvised tools created when primary implements were damaged or lost. Fire-cracked stones scattered around ancient dwelling sites offer clues about heating methods that maximized efficiency while minimizing smoke production. These stones were heated in fires, then used to warm sleeping areas or to melt snow for water without requiring constant attention to open flames. The size and type of stones, their distribution patterns, even the specific ways they cracked under repeated heating and cooling, all of these details contribute to our understanding of technologies that left almost no other trace. The selection of appropriate stones for heating applications required knowledge that extended far beyond simple availability. Stones that contained moisture could explode when heated, creating dangerous projectiles in confined living spaces. Certain rock types retained heat longer than others, making them more valuable for overnight warming applications. Some stones developed toxic fumes when heated, knowledge that meant the difference between a useful tool and a deadly hazard. Excavations sometimes reveal evidence of stone caching, carefully prepared collections of fire-safe stones stored near winter dwelling sites for use during construction and occupation. These caches represent forward planning that began during the summer months, when appropriate stones could be identified, tested, and transported to locations where they would be needed during winter construction activities. A quiet struggle repeated endlessly. The challenge of reconstructing knowledge that was never written down, only demonstrated and remembered. The cultural techniques for working with snow went far beyond simple construction. Different types of snow required different approaches. Fresh powder could be packed and shaped in ways that week-old snow could not. Wind-crusted snow had structural properties that made it valuable for certain applications. Wet snow from warming periods could be formed into nearly waterproof barriers when properly applied. This knowledge was encoded not in written manuals, but in the trained senses of people who had spent their lives working with winter's materials. Traditional snow workers developed almost supernatural abilities to assess snow conditions through subtle sensory cues. They could determine structural properties by listening to the sound snow made when stepped on, cut, or struck with tools. The visual appearance of snow surfaces revealed information about internal crystal structure that determined workability and bonding characteristics. Even the smell of snow could provide clues about temperature history and contamination that affected its suitability for construction purposes. The vocabulary that traditional cultures developed for describing different snow conditions reveals the sophistication of their understanding. Languages that originated in snow-dependent societies often contained dozens of specific terms for snow conditions, each describing a unique combination of factors that determined appropriate usage. These linguistic distinctions represented accumulated knowledge about correlations between observable characteristics and performance properties that could mean the difference between successful construction and structural failure. Snow quality assessment required understanding the complex relationships between temperature, humidity, wind exposure, and time that determined crystal formation patterns. Master builders could read the history of weather conditions in the layered structure of snow accumulations, identifying strata that formed during different storm systems and understanding how these layers would interact during construction and throughout the winter season. The timing of snow shelter construction was crucial and required reading subtle environmental signs that are difficult for modern people to interpret. Beginning construction too early meant working with snow that hadn't achieved the right consistency, while waiting too long meant facing more severe conditions that made building dangerous or impossible. Traditional knowledge included understanding of how temperature fluctuations, wind patterns, and humidity affected snow quality, knowledge that was gained through generations of experience and transmitted through careful observation and practice. Weather prediction skills that accompanied snow construction knowledge represented another domain of traditional expertise that has been largely lost. Traditional builders learned to read atmospheric conditions days in advance, recognizing cloud patterns, wind shifts, and temperature trends that indicated optimal construction windows. This forecasting ability was essential for timing construction activities that might require several days to complete under rapidly changing conditions. The integration of astronomical observations with weather prediction added another dimension to traditional snow construction planning. Seasonal patterns of star positions provided timing references that helped predict general weather trends, while lunar phases were correlated with atmospheric pressure changes that influenced snow conditions. This astronomical knowledge was often embedded in cultural traditions and seasonal ceremonies that reinforced practical information through ritual observance. Snow used for insulation had to be applied in layers, with each layer serving a different purpose. The innermost layer, closest to the living space, was often mixed with organic materials like dried grass or leaves, creating air pockets that enhanced insulation while absorbing moisture from the interior. Middle layers provided structural stability and additional thermal protection. Outer layers were packed more densely to shed wind and precipitation while maintaining the overall integrity of the wall system. The science behind these layering techniques demonstrates sophisticated understanding of heat transfer principles that modern building science has only recently begun to appreciate. The innermost layers created vapor barriers that prevented moisture migration from warm interior spaces into the structural elements of the wall system. Middle layers provided thermal mass that moderated temperature fluctuations and reduced heat loss through convection. Outer layers created wind barriers that prevented air movement from stripping heat from the interior layers. Moisture management within snow structures required understanding of psychrometric principles that governed how water vapor moved through different materials under varying temperature conditions. Traditional builders learned to create ventilation systems that removed excess humidity without excessive heat loss, often incorporating ingenious air circulation designs that used temperature differences to drive air movement without requiring mechanical intervention. The thermal properties of different organic materials used in snow construction were well understood by traditional builders, though this knowledge was expressed in practical terms rather than scientific measurements. Pine needles provided different insulation characteristics than dried grasses, while animal fur offered unique properties that made it valuable for specific applications. The seasonal timing of organic material collection was crucial, as moisture content and structural integrity varied significantly depending on when materials were harvested. The tools used for snow construction were often simple but precisely designed for their specific purposes. Bone scrapers for shaping blocks, wooden paddles for packing, curved knives for cutting, measuring sticks for ensuring uniform dimensions. Each tool reflected deep understanding of the materials being worked and the construction techniques being employed. Many of these tools have disappeared from the archaeological record because they were made from organic materials that decay over time, leaving us to infer their existence from the results they produced. Tool design for snow work required balancing multiple competing requirements that challenged traditional craftspeople to create implements that were simultaneously effective, durable, and practical to manufacture with available materials. Cutting tools needed to maintain sharp edges in extremely cold conditions, while resisting brittleness that could cause catastrophic failure during critical construction phases. Shaping tools required surface textures that prevented snow from sticking while maintaining the grip necessary for precise control during detailed work. The metallurgy of snow construction tools in cultures that had access to metal represented specialized knowledge about how different alloys performed under extreme cold conditions. Iron tools required different maintenance techniques than bronze implements, while the rare availability of steel created tools that were treasured and passed down through generations. The heat treatment of metal tools for cold weather use involved understanding of how temperature cycling affected material properties in ways that differed from temperate climate applications. Handle design for snow construction tools addressed ergonomic requirements that were unique to cold weather work. Handles needed to provide secure grip even when used with mittened hands, while preventing heat conduction that could cause rapid cooling of hands during extended use. Traditional handle wrappings using leather, cord, or organic materials created thermal barriers that improved tool performance while reducing user fatigue and cold injury risk. Elsewhere, another mystery unfolds in the spaces between what we know and what we can only imagine. The process of building a snow-insulated shelter required coordination between multiple family members, each contributing skills and labor appropriate to their abilities and experience. Children might gather and sort materials, adults performed the heavy labor of construction, elders provided guidance based on their accumulated knowledge of what worked well and what led to problems. This collaborative approach meant that knowledge was constantly being shared and tested with innovations gradually incorporated into traditional methods. The social dynamics of snow construction created learning opportunities that extended far beyond simple skill transmission. Working together on construction projects provided natural occasions for sharing stories, testing problem-solving approaches, and reinforcing cultural values about cooperation, persistence, and resourcefulness. These activities strengthened family bonds that would be crucial for maintaining harmony during the months of winter confinement that followed construction completion. Quality control during snow construction required establishing standards and inspection procedures that ensured structural integrity without slowing construction progress unnecessarily. Experienced builders developed techniques for rapidly assessing the quality of individual snow blocks, the adequacy of mortar joints, and the overall stability of developing structures. These quality control methods were often embedded in construction rituals that combined practical assessment with cultural traditions. Project management skills necessary for coordinating complex snow construction activities included resource allocation, task scheduling, and contingency planning that accounted for rapidly changing weather conditions. Traditional builders learned to organize construction sequences that maximize progress during favorable conditions while providing flexibility to adapt to unexpected weather changes or material availability problems. Women often specialized in the interior work, creating efficient layouts for sleeping areas, storage, and cooking spaces, designing ventilation systems that managed smoke and moisture without losing heat, organizing the domestic arrangements that made confined winter living bearable for extended periods. Their knowledge encompassed not just construction techniques, but the human factors that determined whether a winter shelter supported family harmony or created tension that could threaten group survival. The interior design principles that governed traditional snow shelter layouts reflected deep understanding of proxemics, the human behavioral responses to spatial arrangements that influence social dynamics during periods of enforced close proximity. Sleeping area arrangements needed to provide privacy while maintaining warmth. Storage solutions had to maximize space efficiency while ensuring access to essential items. Work areas required adequate light and ventilation while minimizing heat loss. Ergonomic considerations in interior design addressed the physical challenges of living in confined spaces for extended periods. Ceiling heights were calculated to provide adequate headroom while minimizing volume that needed to be heated. Floor designs incorporated drainage and insulation features that maintained comfort while preventing moisture problems. Wall configurations created acoustic properties that reduced the psychological stress of constant close contact. The psychology of color, texture, and lighting in snow shelter interiors was well understood by traditional designers, though expressed in practical rather than theoretical terms. Light-colored interior surfaces reflected available illumination to create brighter living conditions, while textural variations provided visual interest that reduced the monotony of prolonged confinement. Decorative elements, even in purely survival-oriented structures, were recognized as essential for maintaining mental health during difficult periods. Men typically focused on the structural elements, framework construction, wall building, exterior finishing, and the heavy labor of snow, moving and packing, but these gender distinctions were flexible, varying between different groups and adapting to circumstances where individuals might need to perform tasks outside their usual specialization. During emergencies, anyone might need to understand any aspect of shelter construction. The engineering principles that governed structural snow construction required understanding of load distribution, foundation stability, and material properties that rivaled the knowledge base of contemporary building professionals. Traditional builders learned to calculate load-bearing capacities using empirical methods that accounted for the unique properties of snow as a building material. Foundation design principles addressed the challenges of building on frozen or unstable ground conditions that changed throughout the construction and occupation periods. Structural analysis techniques used by traditional builders included visual inspection methods for detecting stress concentrations, deformation patterns that indicated impending failure, and preventive reinforcement strategies that extended structure lifespan under challenging conditions. These analytical skills were developed through experience with structural failures and successes, creating knowledge bases that were constantly updated through practical application. The integration of structural and thermal design requirements created complex optimization problems that traditional builders solved through iterative design processes refined over many generations. Wall thickness had to balance structural strength requirements against thermal performance goals, while window and door openings needed to provide adequate light and access without compromising overall structural integrity or insulation effectiveness. The cultural transmission of snow construction knowledge involved more than verbal instruction. Children learned by observing adults at work, by gradually taking on more complex tasks, by making mistakes in low-stakes situations where errors could be corrected without serious consequences. This hands-on learning created deep, intuitive understanding that went beyond what could be communicated through words alone. The pedagogy of traditional snow construction teaching methods emphasized experiential learning that engaged multiple senses and learning modalities. Students learned to assess snow conditions through touch, sight, sound, and even smell, developing the sensory discrimination abilities that were essential for master-level performance. This multi-sensory approach created robust knowledge that remained accessible under the stress conditions that characterized actual survival situations. Assessment methods in traditional snow construction education involved graduated challenges that tested both technical skills and judgment capabilities. Beginning students might be asked to select appropriate snow for simple tasks, while advanced students faced complex construction challenges that required integrating multiple skill areas under realistic time and weather constraints. These assessments provided feedback that guided continued learning while identifying individuals with aptitudes for advanced specialization. The mentorship relationships that supported snow construction skill development created social bonds that extended far beyond technical training. Master builders often developed lifelong relationships with their students, providing ongoing consultation and support that helped beginning builders avoid dangerous mistakes while encouraging continued skill development and innovation. The rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, participating in a form of education where failure meant not poor grades but possible death. Archaeological evidence suggests that different cultural groups developed distinctly different approaches to using snow for shelter construction, approaches that reflected their specific environmental conditions, available materials, and cultural preferences. Groups living in areas with heavy snowfall developed techniques for managing large volumes of snow, while those in regions with lighter but more persistent snow cover focused on methods for maximizing insulation with limited material. Regional variations in snow construction techniques reveal the influence of local environmental factors on technological development. Arctic coastal peoples developed methods that accounted for wind-driven snow conditions and limited wood availability, while inland forest peoples created techniques that took advantage of abundant organic materials and more sheltered construction sites. Mountain peoples faced unique challenges from rapidly changing weather conditions and developed portable construction methods that could be implemented quickly. The cultural exchange of snow construction techniques occurred through trade relationships, intermarriage, and seasonal migration patterns that brought different groups into contact during construction periods. These exchanges led to hybrid techniques that combined approaches from different traditions, often creating innovations that were superior to either parent technology. Archaeological evidence sometimes reveals construction features that clearly derive from multiple cultural sources. Documentation of traditional snow construction techniques by early anthropologists and explorers provides invaluable records of knowledge that has since been lost, though these accounts often miss subtleties that were obvious to traditional practitioners. Modern attempts to reconstruct traditional techniques using these historical sources frequently reveal gaps in documentation that prevent full recovery of original methods. Some groups created elaborate snow structures that included multiple rooms, storage areas, and specialized spaces for different activities. Others perfected highly efficient single-room designs that could be constructed quickly by small numbers of people. These variations reflected not just practical considerations but cultural values about family organization, privacy, and the relationship between individual and community needs during winter confinement. The architectural sophistication of complex snow structures rivaled that of permanent buildings, incorporating features like entrance tunnels that created airlocks for temperature control, raised sleeping platforms that took advantage of thermal stratification, and sophisticated ventilation systems that maintained air quality while conserving heat. These features required understanding of fluid dynamics, heat transfer, and human factors that demonstrated remarkable engineering capabilities. Construction scheduling for complex snow structures required project management skills that coordinated multiple building phases while accounting for weather variability and material availability changes. Master builders learned to sequence construction activities to minimize weather exposure while ensuring that critical structural elements were completed before conditions deteriorated. The standardization of construction methods within cultural groups allowed for rapid assembly of snow structures using modular components and standardized procedures. These standardization approaches balanced efficiency gains against the flexibility needed to adapt to varying site conditions and material availability. The development of standard dimensions and connection methods facilitated cooperation between builders and reduced construction time requirements. The mystery deepens when we consider structures that combined snow with other materials in ways that created hybrid systems more effective than any single approach. Archaeological sites sometimes reveal evidence of shelters where snow walls were reinforced with wood frameworks, where earth and organic materials were layered with snow to create complex insulation systems, where multiple construction techniques were integrated to address specific local challenges. These hybrid approaches required sophisticated understanding of how different materials interacted, how wood and snow responded differently to temperature changes, how organic materials affected drainage and moisture management, how various combinations influenced structural stability over the course of a long winter. This knowledge represented centuries of experimentation and refinement, gradually developing techniques that optimized available resources for maximum survival advantage. The material science principles underlying successful hybrid construction techniques involved understanding differential thermal expansion, moisture migration pathways, and structural compatibility between materials with vastly different properties. Traditional builders learned to design connection details that accommodated movement while maintaining structural integrity, creating flexible systems that adapted to changing conditions without failure. Interface design between different materials in hybrid structures required solving complex problems about load transfer, weatherproofing, and maintenance access that challenged traditional builders to develop innovative solutions using available materials and tools. These interface solutions often represented the most sophisticated aspects of hybrid construction techniques, requiring master-level skills to implement successfully. A quiet struggle repeated endlessly. The patient process of learning from both success and failure, season after season, generation after generation. The most intriguing aspect of snow shelter archaeology may be what it reveals about the relationship between function and beauty in survival technologies. Even structures designed purely for survival often show evidence of decorative elements, artistic touches that served no practical purpose but enhanced the psychological experience of living in confined spaces during harsh conditions. These aesthetic elements, carved decorations on wooden framework pieces, carefully arranged patterns in stone foundations, symbolic elements incorporated into construction, suggest that people understood survival as encompassing not just physical needs but emotional and spiritual requirements as well. Beauty was not a luxury to be abandoned during hard times, but an essential element of maintaining human dignity and hope during periods of extreme hardship. The psychology of aesthetic elements in survival structures reveals deep understanding of human responses to environmental stress that modern survival psychology is only beginning to appreciate. Decorative elements provided visual stimulation that reduced sensory deprivation effects, while symbolic decorations reinforced cultural identity and spiritual beliefs that supported psychological resilience during extreme adversity. Color applications in snow construction often incorporated natural pigments and dyes that created visual warmth and variety in otherwise monochromatic winter environments. These color applications required understanding of material properties that maintained color integrity under extreme cold and moisture conditions, while using only locally available materials that did not compromise structural performance. The integration of artistic elements with functional construction features created designs that served dual purposes, maximizing the return on labor investment while meeting both practical and psychological needs. Structural elements that also served decorative functions reduced the additional labor required for purely aesthetic features while maintaining the psychological benefits that these elements provided. The social dimensions of snow shelter construction created opportunities for community bonding that may have been as important as the physical protection the structures provided. Working together on construction projects, sharing knowledge and techniques, helping families whose own efforts had failed. These activities strengthened social bonds that would be crucial for survival throughout the winter period. Cooperative labor organization for snow construction required leadership skills, conflict resolution abilities, and resource management capabilities that strengthened community social structures. These organizational skills were tested under stressful conditions that revealed individual capabilities and character traits, providing information that influenced social relationships throughout the winter period and beyond. The reciprocal assistance networks that supported snow construction activities created social obligations and mutual dependencies that enhanced community survival prospects. Families that received construction assistance incurred obligations to provide help in other areas, creating social safety nets that distributed survival risks across the entire community rather than leaving individual families to face challenges alone. Community resource sharing during snow construction periods included not just labor and materials, but specialized knowledge and tools that were owned by individuals but made available for community benefit. These sharing arrangements required sophisticated social protocols that balanced individual ownership rights against community survival needs. Large-scale excavations sometimes reveal evidence of coordinated construction efforts where multiple families built their winter shelters in proximity to each other, sharing labor and resources, creating village-like arrangements that maximized both individual family survival and community cooperation. These settlements required planning and organization that went beyond individual family needs, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of how winter survival could be enhanced through community-level coordination. Settlement planning for winter communities required understanding of site selection criteria that optimized multiple factors, including wind protection, drainage, resource availability, and social interaction possibilities. These planning decisions had to balance competing requirements while accounting for site limitations and seasonal changes that affected community dynamics. Infrastructure development in temporary winter communities included shared facilities like communal cooking areas, tool storage locations, and gathering spaces that enhanced community functionality while reducing individual family construction burdens. These shared facilities required coordination and maintenance agreements that tested community organizational capabilities. The governance structures that emerged in temporary winter communities addressed resource allocation, conflict resolution, and decision-making requirements that arose during construction and occupation periods. These governance arrangements often differed from summer social organizations, adapting to the unique requirements and constraints of winter community living. Let us now drift from daily struggle into mystery, contemplating knowledge that exists in the spaces between archaeology and imagination. The tools and techniques for snow construction were constantly evolving as people encountered new situations and developed innovations to address specific challenges. Climate variations from year to year meant that methods that worked well in one winter might need modification for different conditions. Population movements brought groups into contact with new environments where traditional techniques needed adaptation. This constant innovation means that our archaeological evidence probably represents only a small fraction of the techniques that were actually developed and used. Many innovations may have been tried briefly and then abandoned, either because they proved ineffective or because changing circumstances made them unnecessary. Others may have been used successfully for generations but left no trace that modern archaeology can detect. The innovation processes that drove technical evolution in snow construction involved systematic experimentation with new approaches, careful evaluation of results under actual use conditions, and gradual refinement of successful innovations through repeated application. These innovation cycles were often driven by crisis situations where traditional methods proved inadequate, forcing rapid development of alternative approaches. Knowledge documentation in pre-literate societies relied on memory systems, demonstration methods, and material culture traditions that preserved technical information without written records. These preservation systems were often more robust than written documentation for practical skills, but they were vulnerable to disruption when traditional transmission methods were interrupted. The loss of this knowledge represents one of the great tragedies of cultural disruption. Techniques that took centuries to develop and refine were sometimes lost within a single generation when traditional living patterns were disrupted. Children who should have learned these skills from their parents were instead sent to schools where such knowledge was considered primitive and worthless. Elders who possessed crucial information died without passing it on to successors who had been educated to value different kinds of knowledge. Cultural preservation efforts in the modern era face significant challenges in recovering and maintaining traditional snow construction knowledge. Even when elderly practitioners can be found who retain some knowledge, the absence of practical application context makes it difficult to verify information or fill gaps in understanding. Modern safety concerns and liability issues often prevent the hands-on experimentation that would be necessary for full knowledge recovery. The institutional barriers to traditional knowledge preservation include educational systems that prioritize academic over practical knowledge, economic systems that provide no rewards for maintaining traditional skills, and legal systems that may prohibit or restrict activities that were once essential survival skills. These institutional barriers often make traditional knowledge preservation efforts expensive and difficult to sustain. Documentation methods for traditional knowledge preservation must address the inherent limitations of describing physical skills and sensory discrimination abilities through written or video records. Even the most detailed documentation may miss crucial elements that can only be learned through direct experience under actual conditions. Modern attempts to reconstruct traditional snow construction techniques face the fundamental problem that the knowledge was never fully captured in written form. Even the most detailed ethnographic descriptions miss subtle aspects of technique that could only be learned through direct experience. Contemporary people who attempt to rebuild traditional structures often discover that they lack essential information about material preparation, timing, or construction sequences that were so obvious to traditional builders that they were never explicitly explained. The experiential learning requirements for mastering snow construction techniques create challenges for modern reconstruction efforts that cannot easily replicate the extended practice periods and gradual skill development that characterize traditional learning processes. Modern practitioners often lack the background knowledge about weather patterns, material properties, and environmental conditions that traditional builders acquired through lifetime experience. Safety considerations in modern reconstruction efforts must address liability concerns and modern safety standards that may conflict with traditional practices that were developed in different legal and social contexts. These safety requirements can prevent full replication of traditional techniques while making it difficult to assess the effectiveness of historical methods. The authenticity questions that arise in traditional knowledge reconstruction efforts reflect broader issues about the relationship between historical accuracy and contemporary applicability. Reconstruction efforts must balance scholarly accuracy against practical utility, often creating hybrid approaches that may not fully represent either traditional methods or modern requirements. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, understanding that survival knowledge is not just information, but wisdom gained through lived experience. The mystery of snow as both weapon and shield extends beyond construction techniques to encompass entire worldviews about the relationship between humans and winter. Traditional cultures often developed complex belief systems that helped people understand their place within winter's harsh realities, providing psychological and spiritual frameworks for enduring hardship while maintaining hope for survival. These belief systems typically portrayed winter not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a force to be understood and accommodated. Snow was seen as having agency and intention, requiring respectful interaction rather than simply technical manipulation. This perspective influenced how people approached construction tasks, imbuing practical activities with spiritual significance that may have been crucial for maintaining morale during difficult periods. The animistic worldviews that characterized many traditional cultures created spiritual relationships with natural phenomena that enhanced practical knowledge through emotional engagement and careful observation. Snow was understood as having personality traits, seasonal moods, and behavioral patterns that could be predicted and accommodated through appropriate human responses. Spiritual practices associated with snow construction included ceremonies for requesting cooperation from natural forces, rituals for blessing construction projects, and observances that marked significant phases of construction or seasonal change. These spiritual elements provided psychological support that enhanced practical effectiveness while creating social bonds that strengthened community resilience. Stories told around winter fires often featured snow as a character with its own motivations and personality, sometimes helpful, sometimes dangerous, always demanding respect and careful attention. These stories served not just as entertainment, but as vehicles for transmitting practical knowledge about reading snow conditions, understanding weather patterns, and making appropriate responses to changing circumstances. The narrative structures that embedded practical knowledge in cultural stories created memory aids that enhanced knowledge retention while making technical information more accessible to learners with different learning styles. Stories provided context and meaning that made isolated facts easier to remember and apply under stress conditions. Metaphorical frameworks within traditional stories often encoded sophisticated technical knowledge in forms that were memorable and culturally meaningful. Snow construction techniques might be described through metaphors about cooperation with natural forces, battles against hostile elements, or partnerships between human skill and environmental resources. The oral tradition maintenance systems that preserved story-based knowledge required skilled storytellers, regular telling occasions, and community commitment to preserving cultural information through narrative forms. These preservation systems were often more engaging than formal instruction, but required social continuity to maintain effectiveness over generations. The ceremonial aspects of snow shelter construction have largely disappeared from the archaeological record, but ethnographic accounts suggest that many groups incorporated ritual elements into building activities. These rituals served multiple purposes. They helped coordinate group labor, they provided spiritual protection for the construction process, and they reinforced community bonds through shared participation in meaningful activities. Construction rituals often included blessing ceremonies for tools and materials, seasonal observances that marked optimal construction timing, and completion celebrations that reinforced community bonds and shared accomplishment. These ritual elements created social meaning that enhanced the practical effectiveness of construction activities while strengthening cultural continuity. The temporal aspects of construction rituals addressed the psychological challenges of long-term projects that required sustained effort under difficult conditions. Ritual markers for construction phases provided milestone celebrations that maintained motivation while creating opportunities for assessing progress and adjusting plans as needed. Group synchronization through ritual activities enhanced work coordination while creating shared experiences that strengthened social bonds. Rhythmic work songs, synchronized movements, and group ceremonies all contributed to efficient labor organization while building community solidarity that was essential for winter survival. Elsewhere, another mystery unfolds in the gradual recognition that technical knowledge and spiritual understanding were not separate domains but interconnected aspects of a unified approach to survival. As winter storms bury archaeological sites under layers of snow that will melt and freeze repeatedly over the coming months, we are reminded of the impermanence that characterizes both traditional snow constructions and our efforts to understand them. Each spring, as snow melts and reveals the landscape beneath, it offers new opportunities for discovery, but also washes away evidence that might have helped us understand how people lived through previous winters. This impermanence was built into traditional snow construction from the beginning. Unlike stone or earth structures that were meant to last for years, snow shelters were designed for single-season use, temporary accommodations for the period when other types of shelter were impossible. Their builders understood that they were creating temporary solutions to temporary problems, investing their labor in structures that would inevitably disappear with the changing seasons. The philosophical implications of building with impermanent materials created unique perspectives on the relationship between human effort and natural cycles. Traditional builders accepted transience as a fundamental aspect of their construction activities, focusing on seasonal effectiveness rather than permanent achievement. This acceptance of impermanence may have created psychological resilience that enhanced survival prospects during difficult periods. Design strategies that embraced impermanence often created more flexible and adaptive structures than permanent building approaches. Temporary constructions could be modified throughout their use period, adapted to changing conditions, and abandoned when no longer needed without representing lost investment in permanent infrastructure. Yet this impermanence did not make the structures less important or their construction less skillful. The temporary nature of snow shelters required techniques that could be implemented quickly when needed, using materials that were readily available, creating effective protection without requiring permanent commitment of resources or labor. In some ways, this made snow construction more sophisticated than permanent building because it required achieving maximum effectiveness with minimum investment. The efficiency requirements of temporary construction created design pressures that drove innovation in ways that permanent construction projects might not. Snow builders had to optimize every aspect of their techniques for maximum return on investment, since wasted effort could not be justified by long-term use. This efficiency pressure often led to elegant solutions that achieved multiple objectives through single design elements. Resource optimization in temporary construction required understanding of trade-offs between construction investment and performance benefits that balanced immediate survival needs against longer-term resource conservation. These optimization decisions were complicated by uncertainty about weather conditions, material availability, and construction time requirements. The knowledge needed for snow construction was itself somewhat impermanent, requiring constant practice and reinforcement to maintain proficiency. Skills that were not used regularly could be lost even by individuals who had once possessed them. This created pressure for communities to provide opportunities for learning and practicing construction techniques even in years when they might not be immediately necessary for survival. Skill maintenance systems in traditional communities included practice sessions, demonstration projects, and mentorship programs that maintained construction capabilities during periods when they were not needed for actual survival. These maintenance activities required community resource investment in knowledge preservation that competed with other survival priorities. The seasonal cycles of skill development created learning opportunities during favorable construction periods that had to be maximized to maintain community capabilities for emergency situations. These learning cycles required coordination between practical construction needs and educational objectives that prepared community members for future challenges. Knowledge refresh activities included reconstruction of demonstration projects, competitive construction challenges, and collaborative problem-solving exercises that maintained skills while testing innovations and improvements. These activities served both educational and social functions, while ensuring that essential survival capabilities remained available when needed. A quiet struggle repeated endlessly, the challenge of maintaining knowledge that can only be preserved through practice and use. Modern people attempting to understand traditional snow construction techniques often discover that the knowledge cannot be separated from the broader context of traditional winter living. Construction techniques that seem puzzling in isolation make perfect sense when understood as part of integrated systems that encompassed everything from food preparation to social organization to spiritual practice. The layout of traditional snow-insulated shelters, for example, reflected not just thermal efficiency, but social structures that determined how families organized themselves during periods of close confinement. Ventilation systems addressed not only smoke management but cultural requirements for maintaining appropriate relationships between family members forced to live in extremely close proximity. The holistic integration of technical and social requirements created design solutions that addressed multiple needs simultaneously, maximizing the effectiveness of limited resources while maintaining social harmony. Sleeping arrangements had to balance warmth conservation with privacy requirements, while work areas needed to accommodate multiple activities without creating conflicts over space or resources. Food storage solutions within snow shelters required understanding of preservation principles, access requirements, and security concerns that protected valuable resources from both environmental threats and potential social conflicts. Storage designs often incorporated multiple preservation methods and redundant protection systems that ensured food security throughout the winter period. The acoustic properties of snow shelter interiors influenced social dynamics through their effects on privacy, communication, and psychological comfort during extended confinement periods. Traditional builders understood how different construction techniques affected sound transmission and developed methods for creating acoustic environments that supported family harmony and individual privacy needs. These integrated systems mean that recovering traditional knowledge requires understanding not just technical skills, but entire ways of life that supported and gave meaning to those skills. Without this broader context, even successful reconstruction of traditional structures may miss essential elements that made the original techniques effective for their intended purposes. The cultural context that gave meaning to snow construction activities included seasonal ceremonies, social obligations, and spiritual beliefs that motivated and sustained the intensive labor required for successful construction. These cultural elements provided the social framework that made complex construction projects possible while creating shared understanding about the importance of the work being undertaken. Economic systems that supported snow construction activities included resource allocation methods, labor organization principles, and exchange relationships that ensured construction materials and skilled labor were available when needed. These economic arrangements often differed significantly from summer economic patterns, requiring flexible social institutions that could adapt to seasonal requirements. The educational systems that transmitted snow construction knowledge were embedded within broader cultural transmission processes that taught everything from practical skills to social values to spiritual beliefs. These educational approaches created integrated knowledge that connected technical skills with the cultural contexts that gave them meaning and purpose. The archaeological record provides tantalizing glimpses of this integration, arrangements of artifacts that suggest how people moved through winter spaces, distributions of food, remains that indicate how resources were managed and shared, evidence of activities that reveal how time was organized during periods of winter confinement. But archaeology can only hint at the complex social and cultural systems that made these physical arrangements work effectively. Artifact distribution patterns within excavated snow shelter sites reveal daily activity patterns that show how families organized their winter lives within confined spaces. Tool concentrations suggest work areas for specific activities, while wear patterns on floor surfaces indicate traffic patterns that reveal social hierarchies and spatial organization principles. The seasonal artifact assemblages found at winter dwelling sites often differ significantly from summer camps, suggesting specialized toolkits and material culture systems that were developed specifically for snow construction and winter living. These specialized assemblages demonstrate the technological sophistication that was required for successful winter survival. Trash disposal patterns at winter dwelling sites provide insight into resource conservation practices, sanitation methods, and social organization systems that managed waste production and disposal during periods when normal disposal methods were not available. These waste management systems were essential for maintaining health and social harmony during extended confinement periods. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, recognizing that survival was not just a technical challenge but a total way of life that encompassed every aspect of human experience. Daily routines within snow shelters were carefully orchestrated to maximize thermal efficiency while maintaining social harmony and psychological health during months of confinement. Morning activities were timed to take advantage of solar heating, while evening routines prepared families for the long, cold nights ahead. These daily patterns created structure and predictability that helped maintain morale during difficult periods. Work scheduling within confined winter spaces required coordination between multiple family members engaged in different activities that competed for limited space, light, and heating resources. Traditional families developed sophisticated scheduling systems that maximize productivity while minimizing conflicts over scarce resources. The social protocols that governed behavior within confined winter spaces addressed privacy needs, conflict resolution, and authority relationships that maintained family harmony under stressful conditions. These behavioral guidelines were often embedded in cultural traditions and storytelling that made social expectations clear while providing enforcement mechanisms. Psychological health maintenance during winter confinement required understanding of human responses to isolation, confinement, and sensory deprivation that anticipated and addressed mental health challenges before they became serious problems. Traditional cultures developed entertainment, exercise, and social interaction systems that maintained psychological resilience throughout the winter period. The seasonal transition periods that marked the beginning and end of winter dwelling required careful preparation and adjustment activities that helped families adapt to changing living conditions and social arrangements. These transition periods were often marked by ceremonies and celebrations that provided psychological closure and new beginnings. Resource management during winter confinement required sophisticated planning and allocation systems that balanced immediate needs against long-term survival requirements while accounting for uncertainty about weather conditions and resource availability. These management systems often included rationing protocols, emergency reserves, and sharing arrangements that distributed risks across the entire community. Health maintenance systems during winter confinement address both physical and mental health challenges through preventive measures, treatment protocols, and social support systems that maintained family and community health throughout the difficult winter period. These health systems integrated practical medical knowledge with social and spiritual healing approaches. As we prepare to drift away from these mysteries of snow and survival, we carry with us a deepened appreciation for the complexity that underlies what might seem like simple techniques. The transformation of snow from killer to shelter required not just physical skills but sophisticated understanding of materials, weather, social organization, and human psychology. It represented the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, constantly tested and refined through the harsh teacher of winter survival. The integration of multiple knowledge domains in traditional snow construction demonstrates the holistic thinking that characterized traditional survival systems. Technical knowledge about materials and construction was inseparable from social knowledge about family organization, economic knowledge about resource management, and spiritual knowledge about human relationships with natural forces. The testing mechanisms that validated traditional knowledge included both immediate feedback from construction success or failure and long-term evaluation of techniques through seasonal and generational experience. This testing created robust knowledge systems that were constantly refined through practical application under life-threatening conditions. The transmission systems that preserved and shared traditional knowledge created redundancy and verification mechanisms that ensured essential information was maintained even when individual knowledge holders were lost. These transmission systems included multiple pathways for information sharing and verification processes that tested knowledge accuracy through practical application. The paradox of snow, dangerous and protective, temporary and essential, simple and complex, mirrors larger paradoxes about human survival itself. We are simultaneously vulnerable and resourceful, dependent on our environment and capable of reshaping it, individual and communal, temporary and enduring. The people who learned to build homes from the very storms that threatened to destroy them understood these paradoxes not as philosophical abstractions, but as practical realities that shaped every aspect of their winter lives. The philosophical implications of the snow paradox extend beyond survival techniques to encompass fundamental questions about human relationships with natural environments. Traditional snowbuilders developed worldviews that embraced both human vulnerability and human creativity, accepting environmental constraints while exploring possibilities for adaptation and innovation. The psychological resilience that enabled successful snow construction and winter survival required acceptance of uncertainty, comfort with risk, and confidence in human capabilities that balanced realism about dangers with optimism about possibilities. These psychological qualities were developed through cultural practices and personal experiences that prepared individuals for extreme challenges. The social values that supported snow construction activities emphasized cooperation, mutual aid, and shared responsibility while maintaining individual initiative and personal accountability. These value systems created social cohesion that was essential for survival while encouraging innovation and adaptation that improved survival prospects. Their knowledge lives on not in books or museums, but in the subtle traces they left on the landscape, in the archaeological fragments that hint at techniques we can only partially reconstruct, in the recognition that human survival often depends on our ability to transform apparent obstacles into resources to find protection within the very forces that seem most threatening. The landscape signatures of traditional snow construction activities include not only the obvious circular depressions and post-hole patterns, but also subtle modifications to drainage patterns, vegetation communities, and soil characteristics that reflect centuries of seasonal construction activities. These landscape signatures provide ongoing opportunities for archaeological discovery and knowledge recovery. The genetic heritage of traditional snow construction knowledge may persist in contemporary populations through inherited psychological and physiological adaptations that enhanced survival prospects under extreme conditions. Research into population genetics and adaptive traits may reveal biological aspects of traditional survival capabilities that complemented cultural knowledge systems. The technological heritage of traditional snow construction appears in contemporary building techniques, emergency shelter designs, and survival training programs that incorporate principles originally developed for snow construction applications. These contemporary applications demonstrate the continuing relevance of traditional knowledge for modern survival challenges. The mystery of snow as shelter reminds us that survival knowledge is always more complex than it appears, always embedded in broader systems of understanding, always dependent on wisdom that goes beyond simple technical skill. As winter winds scatter snow across the landscape where ancient shelters once stood, they carry with them the whisper of knowledge that once meant life or death, knowledge that connected people intimately to their environment and to each other in ways that our own survival systems rarely require. The contemporary relevance of traditional snow construction knowledge extends beyond historical interest to include practical applications for emergency preparedness, wilderness survival, and sustainable building practices that can inform modern approaches to environmental challenges. These contemporary applications require adaptation of traditional principles to modern contexts and constraints. The research methodologies that can recover and verify traditional snow construction knowledge include experimental archaeology, environmental reconstruction, and interdisciplinary approaches that combine archaeological evidence with ethnographic documentation, environmental science, and materials engineering. These research approaches can fill gaps in our understanding while testing the effectiveness of reconstructed techniques. The preservation responsibilities that contemporary societies bear for traditional knowledge include documentation efforts, educational programs, and practical application opportunities that maintain knowledge systems for future generations while respecting the cultural context that gave them meaning. These preservation efforts require long-term commitment and community involvement that goes beyond academic research. The wisdom legacy of traditional snow construction encompasses not only technical knowledge but philosophical perspectives on human relationships with challenging environments, social organization principles that supported survival under extreme conditions, and spiritual understandings that provided meaning and resilience during difficult times. This wisdom legacy offers insights that remain relevant for contemporary challenges that require human adaptation and cooperation under stressful conditions. As the snow continues to fall and accumulate across the northern landscapes where these ancient techniques were once practiced, it carries with it the continuing possibility of rediscovery, the ongoing invitation to understand how human ingenuity can transform the most threatening aspects of our environment into the foundations of our survival. The paradox of snow, killer and protector, obstacle and opportunity, remains as relevant today as it was for our ancestors who learned to build their homes from winter's own weapons, creating shelter and warmth from the very forces that sought to destroy them. The eternal cycle of snow falling, accumulating, and melting continues to offer opportunities for those who would learn to read its lessons, to understand its dual nature, and to discover within its crystalline structure both the challenges and the solutions that define the eternal human struggle for survival in a world that is simultaneously hostile and generous, deadly and life-giving, alien and intimately familiar. In this continuing cycle, the ancient knowledge whispers its invitation to those who have eyes to see and hands willing to learn the patient art of transforming winter's weapons into winter's shields. As darkness deepens around us, let us explore one final contrast, the delicate balance between authority and vulnerability when storms make all humans equal. In the heart of winter camps, where families huddled in their modest bark and hide shelters, there often stood structures that spoke of different possibilities. Larger lodges, more elaborate constructions, dwellings that housed not just single families, but served as gathering places for ceremonies, councils, and the complex social activities that bound communities together even during the harshest seasons. These were the lodges of chiefs, medicine people, and respected elders, structures that reflected status and responsibility in ways that went far beyond mere comfort. Yet they also revealed something profound about the nature of privilege in societies where survival depended on cooperation, where individual welfare was inseparable from community welfare, where even the most powerful leaders remained subject to winter's ultimate authority, the rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, understanding that even the grandest shelter was still just a fragile barrier between human life and the endless cold. The council lodge in a traditional winter camp might be twice the size of a family dwelling, its framework constructed from the straightest poles, its covering made from the finest hides available to the community. The fire pit at its center was larger, designed to provide warmth for gatherings of 20 or 30 people. The smoke hole at the peak was more sophisticated, incorporating adjustable flaps that could regulate airflow with greater precision than simpler structures allowed. But size and sophistication came with their own vulnerabilities. A larger structure required more fuel to heat effectively, placing greater demands on the community's wood supply. More complex construction meant more potential points of failure when storms tested every joint and seam. Greater height created larger targets for wind, requiring stronger frameworks and more secure anchoring systems. The chief or medicine person who occupied such a lodge during winter months carried responsibilities that extended far beyond personal comfort. These structures served as community centers where decisions affecting everyone's survival were made, where disputes were resolved, where ceremonies were conducted that maintained the spiritual and social bonds essential for group survival. The leader's dwelling had to accommodate not just their own family, but the needs of the entire community. Elsewhere, another life unfolds, shaped by the weight of responsibility that makes personal comfort secondary to collective welfare. Picture yourself as a respected elder, sitting in the warmest spot of the largest lodge in the winter camp, wrapped in the finest fur robes available, surrounded by the material symbols of your status and authority. Yet even as you enjoy these privileges, you carry knowledge that weighs heavily in the cold darkness. You know how many days of food remain in the community stores, which families are struggling most severely, how much longer the current wood supply will last if the storm continues. Your comfort is conditional, dependent on the welfare of people whose own comfort is far more precarious. If the community's food runs low, you will be expected to share from your stores first. If firewood becomes scarce, your lodge will go cold before family shelters do. If difficult decisions must be made about rationing or resource allocation, you will bear the responsibility for choices that could determine who lives and who dies. The privileges of leadership in winter camps were often more burden than benefit. While a chief might have access to better furs and more elaborate shelter, they also had less personal privacy, less time for rest, greater exposure to the community's problems and conflicts. Their lodge served not as a private retreat, but as a public space where people brought their concerns, their disputes, their requests for help during the most stressful period of the year. The material advantages that marked high status, decorated clothing, carved implements, ornate weapons, became less meaningful during extended winter confinement. When everyone was wrapped in whatever furs would provide the most warmth, when tools were chosen for function rather than appearance, when survival took precedence over ceremony, the visual markers of social distinction faded in importance. A quiet struggle, repeated endlessly. The recognition that authority must be continually earned through service rather than simply claimed through position. The construction of leaders' lodges required community labor and community resources in ways that both demonstrated and tested social bonds. The straightest poles, the best hides, the most skilled workers were devoted to creating structures that served collective needs, but this investment represented significant sacrifice by families who could have used those same resources for their own shelters. This sacrifice was justified by the understanding that community leaders needed adequate facilities to perform their essential functions, but it also created expectations that leaders would use their privileges appropriately. A chief who hoarded resources while community members suffered would quickly lose the respect and cooperation necessary for effective leadership. The larger lodge came with the implicit obligation to use it for community benefit rather than personal aggrandizement. Women who married leaders or were themselves in positions of authority faced particular challenges during winter months. They often served as informal counselors to other women in the community, helping resolve domestic conflicts that could become serious threats to group harmony when families were confined in close quarters for extended periods. Their homes became refuges for women and children facing family difficulties, places where private problems could be addressed before they became community crises. The children of leaders grew up with unique perspectives on winter survival. They witnessed the decision-making processes that affected entire communities, learned to understand the complex calculations involved in resource management and group coordination. But they also experienced the constant pressure of being observed and judged, of having their behavior reflect on their families' reputations, of being expected to set examples for other young people, even when they themselves were struggling with the challenges of winter confinement. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, learning that privilege is not freedom from hardship, but responsibility for helping others endure hardship. The spiritual dimensions of leadership became particularly important during winter months, when communities were isolated from outside contact and dependent entirely on their own resources for maintaining morale and hope. Medicine people and spiritual leaders conducted ceremonies that helped community members cope with the psychological stresses of confinement, the fears about food supplies, the tensions that arose from prolonged close contact with the same people. These ceremonies often took place in the larger lodges that could accommodate community gatherings. The sacred fires burned brighter and longer than those in family shelters, requiring additional fuel but providing spiritual as well as physical warmth. The smoke from these fires was believed to carry prayers and offerings to the spirit world, creating connections between the isolated winter community and the larger cosmic forces that governed their survival. The responsibility for maintaining these spiritual connections was not taken lightly. Spiritual leaders understood that community morale could be as crucial for survival as adequate food supplies or sturdy shelters. Their personal comfort was sacrificed to ensure that they remained available for consultation and guidance whenever community members needed spiritual support, regardless of the hour or the weather conditions. The larger lodges also served as repositories for community memory during winter months. Elders gathered to share stories, to recite genealogies, to preserve historical accounts and traditional knowledge that might otherwise be lost. These activities required space for audiences and comfortable conditions for extended storytelling sessions. The investment in larger, more comfortable structures was partly an investment in cultural continuity. Elsewhere, another life unfolds, in the recognition that some forms of wealth can only be preserved through sharing. Yet winter had a way of stripping away artificial distinctions and revealing fundamental equalities. When blizzards raged for days without pause, when food stores ran critically low, when wood supplies dwindled toward exhaustion, even the largest lodge could become desperately cold. Even the most powerful leader could face the same fears and vulnerabilities as the humblest community member. Archaeological evidence from winter campsites suggests that during extreme conditions, the boundaries between different social levels often broke down entirely. Artifact distributions indicate that people moved freely between structures, sharing resources and labor without regard to normal social hierarchies. The survival of the group took precedence over the maintenance of individual status distinctions. These periods of crisis revealed both the strength and the limitations of traditional leadership structures. Leaders whose authority was based primarily on inherited status or ceremonial position might find their influence diminished when practical survival skills became more important than formal rank. Conversely, Individuals who possessed crucial knowledge about hunting, construction, or resource management might find their status elevated regardless of their traditional social position. The physical structures themselves reflected these dynamics. In normal times, the size and elaboration of dwellings clearly marked social distinctions within winter camps. But when storms threatened to destroy all shelters equally, when survival required maximum cooperation and resource sharing, these distinctions became less relevant than the practical question of which structures could best serve community needs. A quiet struggle repeated endlessly, the challenge of maintaining social order while adapting to circumstances that recognize no social boundaries. Food distribution during winter months provided particularly clear examples of how privilege operated under survival conditions. Leaders typically had access to better food stores, more meat, higher quality preserved foods, greater variety in their diets. But these advantages came with the expectation that they would share when others were in need, that their stores would serve as community reserves during emergencies. The practical management of these expectations required considerable skill and judgment. Leaders had to maintain adequate supplies for their own families while remaining available to assist others in crisis. They had to balance individual needs against community welfare, immediate demands against long-term sustainability. These decisions were made under intense scrutiny, with community members watching carefully to ensure that resources were being used fairly and effectively. The cooking facilities in leaders' lodges were typically more elaborate than those in family shelters, equipped with larger pots, more sophisticated utensils, and arrangements that could accommodate food preparation for community gatherings. But these facilities also required more fuel, more labor, and more resources to operate effectively. The apparent luxury of better cooking equipment came with the obligation to use it for community benefit rather than personal indulgence. During extended winter isolation, the psychological pressures on leaders could become overwhelming. They were expected to remain optimistic and confident even when privately worried about community survival, to make difficult decisions without showing uncertainty, to resolve conflicts while managing their own stress and fatigue. The larger lodge that marked their status also marked them as targets for community frustration when conditions became desperate. The rhythm of their days Imagine yourself there, understanding that the heaviest burden of leadership was not material responsibility, but emotional weight. The relationship between leaders and their communities during winter months was constantly negotiated through both formal and informal interactions. Council meetings in the larger lodges provided opportunities for community input on major decisions, but much of the real communication happened through casual conversations, through shared labor, through the countless small interactions that occurred when people lived in close proximity for extended periods. Leaders who maintained their authority through winter months were typically those who demonstrated genuine care for community welfare, who shared their advantages willingly, who remained accessible and responsive to individual needs even while dealing with larger responsibilities. Those who attempted to use their position for personal benefit at the expense of community welfare often found their influence diminishing as practical survival needs took precedence over traditional respect for authority. The children in leaders' families learned these lessons through direct observation during the most stressful periods of the year. They saw how their parents' apparent privileges were actually responsibilities, how the larger lodge they lived in was really community property, how their families' better food and warmer clothing came with obligations to assist others who had less. These lessons shaped their understanding of leadership as service rather than domination. The seasonal cycle of leadership reflected these dynamics. During summer months, when resources were abundant and communities were mobile, social distinctions could be maintained through ceremonial displays and material accumulations. But winter stripped away these superficial markers, revealing which leaders possessed the practical skills, emotional strength, and community commitment necessary for survival-based leadership. Elsewhere, another life unfolds. In the recognition that true authority comes not from power over others, but from willingness to serve others' needs. The architectural features of leaders' lodges reflected their dual nature as both private residences and public facilities. Interior arrangements had to accommodate family privacy while remaining suitable for community gatherings. Storage areas needed to hold both personal belongings and community resources. Sleeping arrangements had to provide comfort for the leader's family while ensuring that visitors and temporary residents could be accommodated when necessary. These design challenges required sophisticated understanding of how space could be organized to serve multiple functions simultaneously. Traditional builders developed innovative solutions, movable partitions that could create privacy when needed but be removed for large gatherings, multi-level storage systems that maximized capacity while maintaining accessibility, ventilation arrangements that could handle variable occupancy levels without compromising air quality. The heating systems in larger lodges were particularly complex, requiring careful engineering to ensure that the entire space could be warmed effectively without wasting fuel. Multiple fire pits, strategic placement of heat-reflecting surfaces, and sophisticated smoke management systems were all necessary to make large structures habitable during severe cold spells. This complexity made these lodges more vulnerable to heating system failures that could quickly make them uninhabitable. Maintenance of leaders' lodges during winter months required constant attention from multiple community members. The larger surface areas and more complex construction meant more opportunities for storm damage, more places where insulation could fail, more systems that needed regular adjustment and repair. This maintenance work was typically shared among community members as part of their obligation to support leadership infrastructure, but it also created additional labor demands during the season when energy was most precious, a quiet struggle repeated endlessly. The recognition that apparent privilege often masks deeper forms of vulnerability and responsibility. As winter storms reached their peak intensity, the differences between the grandest lodge and the humblest shelter became almost meaningless. Wind that could collapse elaborate frameworks showed no respect for the status of their occupants. Cold that penetrated the finest hides affected leaders and followers equally. Hunger that came from depleted food stores created the same physical suffering regardless of social position. These moments of extreme hardship often produce the most profound demonstrations of community solidarity. Archaeological evidence suggests that during the worst storms, normal dwelling patterns were abandoned entirely as people crowded together in whatever structures offered the best protection. Leaders opened their lodges to accommodate as many people as possible, abandoning privacy and comfort to ensure that everyone had access to the warmest available shelter. The stories told around winter fires during these crisis periods often emphasized themes of equality and mutual dependence rather than hierarchy and individual achievement. Traditional narratives that celebrated great leaders were balanced by stories that showed how survival ultimately depended on cooperation, how individual greatness meant nothing without community support, how the most powerful people were also the most dependent on others' loyalty and assistance. These cultural messages helped communities maintain unity during times when stress and scarcity could easily lead to fragmentation and conflict. They reminded people that their leaders were also vulnerable human beings facing the same fundamental challenges, that survival required everyone's contribution regardless of their formal status, that winter's ultimate lesson was about interdependence rather than independence. The rhythm of their days, imagine yourself there, learning that winter's greatest teaching was about the illusion of separation between leaders and followers, between privilege and vulnerability. As the longest nights gradually began to shorten, as the worst storms began to show signs of weakening, the winter camps that had served as refuges for months would eventually dissolve back into the mobile patterns of warmer seasons. The larger lodges that had served as community centers would be abandoned along with the family shelters, their materials reclaimed for other uses or simply left to decay naturally. But the lessons learned during winter confinement about leadership and service, about privilege and responsibility, about the fragile nature of all human distinctions in the face of natural forces, would carry forward into the mobile seasons. Leaders who had proven themselves during winter crises would find their authority strengthened. Those who had failed the tests of winter leadership would discover that communities have long memories for both generosity and selfishness displayed during times of desperate need. The architectural knowledge that went into constructing the elaborate winter lodges would be preserved and refined, passed down to future generations who would face their own winters and their own challenges in balancing individual welfare with community survival. The techniques for creating spaces that could serve both private and public needs, that could accommodate both ceremony and crisis, would remain part of the cultural toolkit available for future survival challenges. The social lessons were equally important and equally durable. The understanding that privilege comes with responsibility, that leadership means service rather than domination, that apparent advantages often mask deeper vulnerabilities. These insights would influence how communities organized themselves during both easy and difficult times, how they chose their leaders, and defined their expectations for those leaders' behavior. Elsewhere, another life unfolds in the eternal cycle of seasons that strips away illusions and reveals fundamental truths about human nature and human community. As we prepare to leave behind these winter camps, these lodges both grand and humble, these communities that found ways to survive together through the harshest conditions their environment could produce, we carry with us a deeper understanding of how human societies actually function when stripped of their superficial complexities. Winter revealed that the most successful communities were those that balanced individual needs with collective welfare, that supported leadership while holding leaders accountable, that maintained social order while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. The storms that tested these communities also strengthened them, creating bonds forged in shared hardship that would endure long after the specific challenges that created them had passed. The lodges that served as symbols of status during winter months were ultimately symbols of something more profound, the human capacity to create beauty and meaning even under the most difficult circumstances, the understanding that survival requires not just individual strength but collective wisdom, the recognition that true wealth lies not in what we possess, but in what we are willing to share with others when they need our help. As our quiet journey through history's winter camps draws to its close, the storms have passed now in our story and in our minds, leaving behind the profound silence that follows great struggles. In the deep quiet of this moment, we can almost hear the gentle sounds of ancient communities stirring back to life. The soft scraping of snow being cleared from shelter entrances, the careful steps of people emerging into pale sunlight after months of confinement, the quiet conversations of survivors sharing their relief and planning for the seasons ahead. What have we learned from these people who turned earth and wood and hide into homes, who transformed the very snow that threatened them into walls of protection, who found ways to maintain humanity and hope under conditions that tested every assumption about what human life could endure? We have learned that survival is rarely about dramatic heroism, but about the patient repetition of small acts of care, tending fires, sharing food, mending shelters, comforting children, maintaining faith that difficult times will eventually pass. We have learned that the strongest communities are those that balance individual needs with collective welfare, that support their leaders while holding them accountable for serving rather than ruling. The rhythm of their days. Imagine yourself there, one final time, understanding that their quiet strength flows forward through time to touch our own lives. Perhaps most importantly, we have learned that comfort and hardship are not simply opposites. but different teachers offering different lessons about what it means to be human. The people in our story found meaning and beauty even in the midst of privation, created art and ceremony, and community bonds that enriched their lives beyond mere survival. Tonight, as you rest in your own warm shelter, as you drift towards sleep protected by walls that require no daily repair, heated by systems that need no constant tending, supplied by networks that stretch far beyond your immediate community, you can carry with you the quiet satisfaction of having touched something essential about human resilience. The winter camps are empty now, their fires long cold, their stories preserved only in the whispers of wind across the places where they once stood. But the lessons they offer remain as relevant as ever, lessons about cooperation and sacrifice, about finding strength in community, about the profound human capacity to create warmth and meaning even in the coldest, darkest times. Let these gentle lessons settle into your consciousness like snow falling on quiet ground, layer upon layer building towards something soft and protective that will remain with you long after this story ends. Rest now knowing that you are connected to an ancient lineage of survivors, that the same strength that carried people through countless winters flows also in your own veins, ready to warm you through whatever seasons lie ahead. The storms always pass, the communities endure, and in the morning there is always the possibility of light returning to the world. Sleep well, gentle traveler. The winter camps are waiting to welcome you back whenever you need their quiet wisdom about the art of simply continuing, one day at a time, until the seasons change and the world grows warm again. As the story fades, thank you for spending this quiet time with me. If you'd like more slow journeys like this, almost every day, you're welcome to subscribe. There's another soft-spoken tale waiting right here, or you can tap below to stay close to our nighttime history community. Rest easy, and I'll see you soon.